simply wasn't how a jihad should be fought, they were convinced. Their view was that fighting is a man-to-man exercise, and it requires a process of inner spiritual warfare so that one can acquire the virtue known as futuwa, or chivalric, heroic warriorhood. And to those people, it really seemed completely un-Islamic that one could shoot somebody with a bullet. To shoot somebody from a distance seemed like a terribly unchivalric, cowardly kind of thing to do. And for this reason, and for various others, the Ottoman army continued to sustain loss after loss at the hands of its better-equipped Christian enemies. Now, the controversy was the argument over printing. Printing came pretty late to the Islamic world. We picked up paper long before the Europeans did from the Chinese, but we didn't pick up the habit of printing from the Chinese. Partly because many of the ulama, in many periods a majority of the ulama, simply believed that printing books was haram. The view was that a text, particularly one dealing with a holy subject such as religion, was something spiritual, almost a sacred phenomenon, and hence couldn't be created in any other way than the traditional loving way through calligraphy, bookbinding, engraving, gilding, and the arts that were cultivated as forms of religious sacred art by the guilds. Also, the ulama thought that a ready availability of Islamic literature was going to cheapen Islamic learning and make students lazy about memorizing texts. It was also thought by some ulama that the process of physically printing pages was actually disrespectful to books, particularly the Quran. And it actually took a Hungarian convert to Islam, a very interesting individual called Ibrahim Mutafarriqa, to change all of this. And in the 1720s, he opens Islam's first printing press with the permission of the Khalifa in Istanbul. Mutafarriqa was a very sincere person. He wasn't a kind of crypto-secularizing subversive. He left us with a short spiritual autobiography, which he calls Risale Islamiyya, which describes how he came to Islam, having been of a Hungarian Christian background, and actually converting to Islam after, some years after the Ottomans had left Hungary. But also, partly because of his ability as a convert to bridge two worlds, he was very aware of the technological backwardness of the Ottoman Empire and of its administrative backwardness. And he printed a book, one of the first books ever printed by a Muslim, which was called Nizam al-Hakam. He printed this in 1733. And in this manifesto, that really is what it is, a manifesto for reform among Muslims, he sets before the traditional Muslim elite, the Khalifa, his courtiers, the court elite, the ulama, the scribal classes, military leadership, the various technological and military reforms that had been taking place elsewhere in Europe. And he warns the Muslim elite that unless Muslims borrow not just from Europe's military technology, but also from its styles of administration and scientific research, then there are going to be no independent Muslim states. Slowly these warnings were heeded by an inherently very conservative Islamic world, and the Ottoman state slowly started the painful process of modernizing itself, attempting all along to preserve what was seen as essential to a core Islamic identity. And that began really the very difficult process of accommodation that we, as Muslims living in the West, have to face every moment of our lives today, and which is really at the core of all of our relevant Muslim agendas. And really the Hungarian story reminds us that unless we Muslims are conscious of the wider global trends of the age, and unless somehow we come to an understanding with its technologies and its instruments, we will continue to be losers. A severe form of conservatism brings spiritual advantages, to be sure, but these are soon outweighed by the spiritual collapse which is produced by the experience of defeat and marginality. Nothing is worse for a religion's sense of spiritual coherence than the sense of defeat. Nowadays, Muslims in the core Islamic countries often seem to betray the same kind of attitude, because very often we have an endless fascination with short-term political issues, most of the Islamic movements active now are really involved with short-term issues. And there is a general backdrop of very severe ignorance of the larger tendencies, the big global historic sea changes that are taking place, of which those short-term phenomena are simply the passing manifestations. So typically our state is, as Islamic activists, that we treat the symptoms rather than the underlying disease. And this ignorance can sometimes, in my experience, be quite astonishing and quite terrifying. We have to ask how many leaders of enormous Islamic movements in the world today, sometimes numbering millions of followers, are really acquainted with the ideas that underpin modernity and drive the modern world. Do they really know where they are in history? How many of them can even name the principal intellectual systems of our time? Structuralism, post-structuralism, analytic philosophy, critical theory, postmodernism, and all the rest. Many of them, admittedly, very specious philosophical systems. All of these are simply closed books to them. Very often, they've never even heard of them. Instead, they endlessly burble on about the international Zionist Masonic conspiracy, or the new Crusader invasion, or similar phantasms. So if we want to understand why so many of these huge Islamic movements simply fail, perhaps we should begin by acknowledging, rather painfully, that many, at least, of their leaders simply don't have the intellectual grasp of their context in the modern world, which really is the precondition for successfully overcoming the obstacles to the establishment of a truly Islamic order. A Muslim activist who cannot even name the ideologies of modernity cannot realistically hope to overcome them. A no less lamentable ignorance prevails, I think, in the case of the non-ideological trends of the dying 20th century, and which are likely to become far more important and more immediately relevant to us as the new millennium gets going. Like Ibrahim Mutafarriqa 3 centuries ago, Muslims living in the West have to shoulder the duty of alerting other Muslims to the new global realities which are shaping a world in which traditional forms of discourse will simply have no application whatsoever. The younger generation simply not speaking the same cultural language as their parents. It's simply suicidal to assume that in any context whatsoever we can be insulated from these new global realities. The future of the East is actually a Western future. Easternness, indigenous, autonomous, authentic cultures are everywhere and inexorably giving way to the Western reality. Increasingly, we live in a single world, thanks to a monocultural process which is accelerating all the time, driven by the mass media and even more modern forms of communication and cultural diffusion. So we live in an interlocking world. There is now a mosque in the World Bank. Interesting, ironic, strange. And there's also 2 branches of McDonald's in Mecca. In fact, as soon as you come out of the main door, the Bab al-Malik Abdal Aziz now of the Haram extension in Mecca, the first thing you see is not one of the houses of the Sahaba, or one of the mountains, or one of the beautiful traditional things that you would have seen but a few years ago. You see Colonel Sanders.